Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my backyard. Today we're going to do a video on cutting cookies or rounds or wood discs. Basically just an end grain cut off a log. I've had a lot of requests to do a video about that. We're also going to talk about drying these things because if you've ever tried to cut and dry these things, you know they can be notorious for cracking and splitting. So we'll talk about why that is and some ways to help prevent that. So the large round that I have on the mill right now is from the last log that I cut on the mill. Before I got to that log, it was being cut up for firewood. So someone was coming by and making cuts off of it to make some rounds to be split to firewood. So this was still partially attached when I picked up the log, and I ended up cutting it off when I milled the rest of the log. So because I built my mill with my runners with about 2 feet apart, I was able to put this round on there. It's about 30 some inches in diameter, and I'm going to make some rounds that are going to become little like side tabletops. I know I'm going to use one for sure for a side table in the house. So I'll start by making a facing cut to get a nice flat top, and then I'll start making these slices down to reveal each of the discs, or each of the cookies, or whatever you want to call them. I'm going to make these 3 inches thick, and I should be able to get 3 of them out of here. I want to try and stay away from the outsides at this point because it's been sitting around for a while, so those outsides have already been exposed to a lot of drying and they probably have a little bit of cracking in them already. So I want to make sure I remove those sections and leave a little bit of waste just to make sure that the rounds that I have towards the center are as good as possible. So the whole idea with drying these things is to have them experience the least amount of stress as possible, make that drying process as gentle as possible. And there are 2 ways to accomplish that. The first way is to dry them as slowly as possible so that as stresses build throughout the cookie, it's really even and you don't have a lot of stress towards the top as opposed to towards the center. Now the other way is to actually replace the water so the cells don't actually shrink at all. And to do that, there's products out there you can use. Today I'm going to be trying out Pentacle, which is a little bit on the expensive side for that drying method. And the other method, the slow drying, I'm going to use the standard good old Anchor Seal, which is a wax emulsion that just kind of goes on. It's kind of like a waxy coat that you can put on the end of logs to keep them from drying out too fast, and checking on the ends as they are in log form, or to slow out drying bowl blanks, whatever. This just allows the wood to dry more slowly, kind of seals it up, prevents a lot of moisture loss. The Pentacle actually goes in and replaces the water molecules inside the cells so that they don't actually collapse and shrink as they're drying. So I have these large cookies here. I'm actually not even sure if this gallon is going to be enough to do more than one. I'm going to try and do two with it, but the manufacturer gives you a lot of literature about using this thing. And the best way to do it is to actually submerge the piece of wood for an extended period of time to absorb as much as possible to get like a full saturation. Now, I don't have anything big enough to put this into like a swimming pool, and I don't have, you can buy it in 55-gallon drums, but it's going to cost you a few $1,000s. So I'm going to see what I can do with some plastic sheeting and pouring it on and letting it soak in. I'll keep watching it for a few days until it just doesn't soak up any more of this stuff, and hopefully I can get through a couple of these. The other two, I'm going to use the Anchor Seal on. I'm going to use the Anchor Seal on the ones towards the outside of the log. I think those ones are going to be the most prone to cracking because they've already developed some stress as this round has been sitting around in log form for so long. And then as a little bit of a control, I have these offcuts out here, which I will leave as is, and we'll take a look at how goofy those things get. They're already cracking a little bit, and I'll tell you what, those are going to potato chip because they're kind of thin. So I'm going to get all set up for that. I'll do the Anchor Seal first because that one's really easy to apply. All you have to do is paint it onto the surface and let it dry. I think with these things, I'll go ahead and apply 2 coats just to make sure I have a really good sealing, or yeah, sealing. Sealing with an S, now with a C. So while I'm letting that Pentacle absorb, I'm going to go ahead and cut some smaller cookies here out of this butternut log. Now, since this log has a smaller diameter than that larger white oak round, I can't just place this one onto the bunks of the mill. So I've put down a piece of sheet goods to span 2 of the bunks to create a little platform for it. And I've also added a fence against the side stops to help hold the log in place. So this is the 3rd day of applying the Pentacle. The surface is pretty dry. I let it sit overnight, but I've been trying to keep this thing wet as much as possible. I am definitely going to run out of this stuff. Hopefully I've applied enough that it's not going to matter, but ideally, according to the directions, this thing would absorb as much of this as possible till it wouldn't absorb anymore. So after the first day, I let the Pentacle sit on the surface, and I kept applying it, keeping it wet, until when I flipped it over, I could see some start coming through the other side. At that point, I knew that the Pentacle was penetrating all the way through the end grain of this cookie, and I was kind of getting some in the middle of the wood itself. So I'm just going to reapply this again today. I'll use up whatever I have here, and hopefully there'll be enough. I also did a couple of these smaller butternut cookies. I don't have nearly as much Pentacle on those ones as I do on these much larger white oak cookies. So hopefully those ones will still work out as well, but yeah, we'll see. So if you do want to try using Pentacle on a cookie, just to give you an idea how much you're going to need. This 1 gallon was not enough for 2 30-inch diameter, 3-inch thick cookies. I'm not really sure how much you would need, but I think it would be safe to say you would probably need somewhere around 3/4 of a gallon per cookie this size. So unless you are just doing small cookies, if you want to do anything this large, I would recommend not buying a gallon. I'd recommend spending the money and buying a 5-gallon pail. You'll save a little bit of money on the volume, and you're gonna end up using it anyway. So I think the 5-gallon pail is like $250. It's cheaper than buying 5 individual 1-gallon jugs. But then again, I guess we'll see if this actually makes a difference. And it also depends on what you're trying to do. I personally don't really care if this cracks. I'll just fill the crack with epoxy and, you know, move on with my life. But if you're looking for something that looks perfect as the day you cut it, then maybe it's worth the money. So here are the big cookies. These two here have just the Pentacle on them, and the 2 outside ones have 2 coats of anchor seal on them. Now, the Pentacle, the directions also say that a good idea would be to apply a greenwood sealer like anchor seal on top of this to further slow the drying process down. So I'm going to apply anchor seal to one of these, and then we'll see what happens to the other one that just has the Pentacle on it. Now, one thing I'm noticing already is that these with the Pentacle have actually cracked throughout the middle here, a lot more than either of just the anchor seals have. So I think happened with this is, since I didn't actually have these submerged, I was just applying the Pentacle to the surface and letting it soak in. That gave time for the cookie to actually dry out, lose some moisture, and start cracking a little bit. So probably the most, obviously the most ideal case for using the Pentacle, if you go that route, is to fully submerge these things for a few days to make sure they are fully saturated and don't have any drying at all as you're applying that product. And then once you fully apply that product, you can let the surface kind of dry off a little bit and seal it with an end grain sealer like anchor seal, and hopefully that'll work out pretty well. Now, probably the overarching theme with this is drying them as slow as possible. So I'm going to put these in my shed, and I'm going to set them up so they don't have much airflow. There's not much airflow in the shed already because it is a closed off space. I'm going to stack these things with some really thin stickers, 1/2-inch stickers, and then I'll also put an offcut from this cookie set on top so the top cookie doesn't get as much airflow if I had just left it uncovered. That should hopefully really slow the drying process down, and we'll kind of see how these things go over the next few months and maybe even a year. I'm not really even sure how long it's going to take to dry, but it wouldn't surprise me if I'm looking at like a whole year to get these things to be just drying as slowly as possible. So these cookies have been drying for 11.5 months now, so almost a year. I'm gonna start pulling these things out. We can take a look at how they're drying. We'll take a look and see how the 3 different preparation techniques kind of compare to each other, and also take a reading with the moisture meter to see where things are at as far as how dry they are, and just overall see where things are at this point. So just looking at the stack right now, I can already see some cracks forming on all of them, so I don't know if we're going to get anything that's going to be super perfect at this point, but we'll see. So we have the ones that are coated with just anchor seal here, these 2 guys. The one in the middle here is both Pentacle and anchor seal, and this one down here is just Pentacle. So now, first observation is I have a lot of mold building up on all of these cookies, which in this case is actually a good sign. Tells me they're not drying very quickly. There isn't much airflow, so that's causing moisture on the surface to stay there, allowing for mold and things like that to grow. So, you know, a little gross, but a good sign showing that it's not the fact that it's drying too quickly that's causing all these to crack. Now, speaking of cracks, all of these samples have cracks. So here's a closer look at just the Pentacle. You can see I have a lot of cracks forming radially through here. And the interesting thing with all of these is they had that initial crack to the center from before when this thing was around and started drying. but that hasn't gotten any bigger, which is kind of really interesting to me. So coming over to this one, this is the Pentacle coated in anchor seal, and you can see I do have the radial cracks here as well. However, they are bigger, but there are fewer of them, which is kind of an interesting observation as well. So now these two here with all the mold, these are the ones that are coated in the anchor seal. And interestingly here is there's a lot more cracking in these, but also it's a lot of kind of different cracking. So in these you still have the large radial splits, but you also have a lot of little tiny radial cracks as well, which the ones with the Pentacle did not have. So getting a bit closer, this is just the Pentacle, this is just anchor seal. You can see on the one with the anchor seal, there's a lot of these little tiny cracks through here. And on the Pentacle, there are no cracks in this whole pie section here. There's these two little radial splits here, and there's nothing all the way down until this big crack down here. So on these, none of them actually developed any cracking, which is really interesting. So I have the ones with anchor seal, these two here are Pentacle, and these two here are also anchor seal. All of them exhibit no cracking whatsoever, so that's kind of interesting in itself, I guess. So let's get a reading on the moisture content. Pentacle is still soaking wet. It is still way above what my meter can even read. Looks like I'm getting into what I can read over here at 31%, but everything else is somewhere above 32, so this basically hasn't even dried at all. On here, getting the same thing, so really these still have a long ways to go. Yeah, 32. So they're just coming into the low 30s now, it looks like. So yeah, these still have a lot of dry time to go. So that probably means that the cracking is just starting now, and it's really only going to get more severe from this point. And the butternut is sitting around 15, 16 or so. So these are pretty close to being dried, and that probably means that they're going to stay like this without any more cracking or any cracking developing. So I brought in the offcut that I did not coat, that I also stuck out there in the shed with the other cookies to dry, so we can take a look at how that thing fared. So we have some pretty significant cracks through here, some pretty big ones, but one thing that this one has that the other ones don't is all of these little tiny surface checks. So looking a little closer, you can see all of these little cracks through here from this thing just drying too quickly. So this area right here is about the same thickness as the cookies I had cut. So let's see how dry that is. And we got about 16% or so. So about as dry as the butternut had dried to in the same amount of time. So now maybe the question in your mind is, why do these things crack at all, and why are they so difficult to dry without cracking? And the answer to that is actually pretty straightforward. There are two different planes in the wood that affect how it dries. So the first plane is the tangential plane, and that is the plane of the growth rings. So if you imagine the growth rings coming around and making a circle around the whole cookie, that right there is your tangential plane. Now the other plane extends from the center of the tree outwards, so the thickness of the growth rings, so across the growth rings in this direction here. That is the radial plane. Now the reason there's so much stress builds up on these things, which ultimately causes them to crack, is the relationship between these two planes. The radial plane will shrink about half as much as the tangential plane, which causes that stress to build up. So pretend this is the end of a log, and we have a growth ring that we can kind of have wrapped around the log to simulate one growth ring on the log. So as water is being released from this, things are shrinking. The inside core here is going to shrink in its radius, so that's the radial plane shrinking, but the tangential plane, the actual growth ring itself, if we were to unroll that, it's going to shrink as well. So if I make it shrink by just removing some material here, and then try and wrap it back around this radial plane, which has not shrunk nearly as much, you can see that there is a gap in there, and that is what would become a crack. So you can also think about it this way. So these growth rings are trying to shrink in length, but they're not shrinking fast enough in thickness. So the core around the inside of our fake growth ring isn't getting smaller. So this thing, the growth ring, is trying to compress the core. And as it tries to compress, that core is not going to let it compress enough, and eventually it'll break, and that's what you get with the actual cracks. So I did show cutting these on my bandsaw mill, but of course there are other ways to do this as well. such as using a chainsaw, or if the log is small enough to do it on your bandsaw in the shop. So if you're going to use a chainsaw, the biggest thing you have to kind of concern yourself with is being able to cut the slab or the cookie to a consistent thickness. So if you have a chainsaw mill and the log you're trying to cut into cookies is big enough, you can use a chainsaw mill to guide the saw through the cut and get a nice consistent cut that way, just like if you're going to slab up any other log. Now, if you're going to do it freehand, it's going to be a little more on the challenging side. The way that I find works best for me to get a consistent cut using a chainsaw, making sure that cut is exactly the same width on top and the bottom, is to plant the dogs in the log somewhere around like the 2 o'clock position and just let the saw kind of pivot and fall through the cut, as opposed to trying to cut with the saw all the way straight down like that. I have some shots here of me trimming some logs using that technique, and it actually works out really well. You just allow gravity to pull the saw through the cut, pivoting off that one point, and it gives you a really nice consistent cut all the way down through the log. Now, if you're going to do this on your bandsaw in the shop, one thing you do want to keep in mind is you're cutting a cylinder on a saw blade traveling in the downward direction. So if that log is not supported and you run that log into the blade, something happens, the log could roll out of your hands and pretty much just get thrown back at you. So you might want to build yourself a little bit of a cradle to support that thing as you're cutting it, just to make sure nothing crazy happens in your shop. So that is cookie cutting and a little bit of drying. These didn't really dry as fast as I thought they would, so I'll probably do a follow-up video in like a year or something once those things have gotten hopefully fully dried by then, or at least a lot closer to it, and we'll see how things kind of fare. At this point, I would say that nothing I have shown in this test is conclusive, but at least it kind of gives you some ideas of kind of how things can go. As far as if buying and using Pentacle is worth it, I guess we'll find out in a year for sure, but just looking at the results right now, it does seem to help at least to restrict the checking and the cracking to just the bigger spots and not allowing the bunch of small areas to be all checked up. So the nice thing about that is you have less work to do if you're going to fill those cracks with epoxy, because you just have a few big cracks to fill as opposed to like 100 little ones that would be kind of annoying to do. So that's it for this one. Thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments about anything I talked about today, anything here in my shop or back on the sawmill, please feel free to leave me a comment. As always, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.